I just had somebody recently ask me about anti-inflammatories. I think they were talking about curcumin or turmeric. The studies on that aren't conclusive. There's not a lot of evidence that it's even necessary if you don't have inflammation. Again, that's why we do the blood test. If you don't have elevated homocysteine or C-reactive protein, why are you taking anti-inflammatories? And can they actually impair the acute inflammatory response that's necessary for hormesis for you to actually recover from the workouts?
It's another reason for the blood work.
Another reason for the blood work.
There's some things you don't need.
Stan, what should I take? What are you deficient in? What's your current health status? So talk about sleep. Again, the primary is protein intake. The diet in general, I try and get a diverse range of proteins that are highly bioavailable and micronutrient dense, okay? And by that, I mean something that historically would be eliminated by the guru diet or the your typical nutritionist diet for the bodybuilding, figure, physique, bikini, wellness, mankini. Those diets are so unbelievably restrictive, and I've been dealing with this since the late 80s and trying to talk out about it because I saw how much damage they did, both to me personally trying to over-restrictively diet or even on the other end of the spectrum to dirty bulk, the gallon of milk a day and the cheese pizzas and the ice cream. I experienced metabolic syndrome, and on the other end, I experienced a significant amount of muscle loss preparing for powerlifting. I've gained and lost over the course of my competitive career well over 1,000 pounds, albeit intentionally to meet my goals at the time. But I experienced all these problems, and just from happenstance or from trial and error, I've come across what, we said today that we're not gurus, we didn't invent this, what Vince Gironda was talking about in the 60s, steak and eggs. There's a reason for that. And he was also talking about getting iodine. I think he was using sea kelp. Yeah, I recommend for compliance either iodized salt or cranberry juice because you sweat out iodine and it's important for thyroid function. And this happens today. You go to a nutritionist about your bodybuilding prep and they're like, okay, eliminate red meat, eliminate dairy, eliminate fruit, eliminate salt. I mean, it's right out of the gate. And the diets look the same. It's egg whites, tilapia, some boneless, skinless chicken breast, and all the broccoli you can possibly stuff in your mouth for fiber and what have you. That's incredibly restrictive. And what we see is, particularly in women, because they eat fewer calories than men, we see the female triad. We see chronic calorie restriction resulting in anemia. We see low calcium as a part of that. And we see amenorrhea, a cessation of the menstrual period. These are three things that we commonly see, and I saw it in athletes at the University of Oregon. Way back in the early 90s, I was training runners, both sprinters and distance runners. And the women in particular, and I think this came up recently in Nike, they are actually sanctioned that they couldn't give diets to their athletes because up at Nike, they had a female runner, I think just within the last couple of years, came out and said that because of the chronic dieting, she ended up suffering from the female triad and had osteoporosis as a result. Her menstrual period stopped, obviously. She started having shin splints. And I saw that in the early 90s. I thought the women would actually wear braces and go out and run on their shins to do that. So I started seeing this in the bodybuilding industry, physique, figure, bikini, et cetera. One of the more prevalent symptoms of this restrictive diet, the egg whites lack biotin, the avidin robs biotin from the body because you're not eating the yolk, and so now that's for your skin, hair, and nails. The chronic restriction, of course, has a massive effect on the thyroid, and so now that dry skin, hair, and nails starts falling out. You get these women with patches of hair falling out as they prep for competitions. The anemia, avoid red meat. Well, where do you think the iron is? And you got a woman who's menstruating, eating egg whites and tilapia and whey shakes. Which, as an aside, has anybody ever been backstage at a bodybuilding bikini show? The stink back there is horrendous. Can you imagine egg whites, protein powders, and broccoli? Can you imagine what that smells like back there? It's unnecessary. It's over-restrictive. It's caused a host of acute and chronic conditions that even after the show, they end up at the hospital or at the doctor's office getting shots for iron and B12 and antidepressants for that matter. Suffering from massive edema to the point where it's quite dangerous, the swelling of the ankles and the water retention, an extraordinary amount of immediate fat regain. It happens much faster than the muscle rebounds. So they end up actually with a worse metabolism than prior to starting diet, heavier with a slower basal metabolic rate. So I've seen this happen chronically since as far back as the late 80s and early 90s. And so the vertical diet was intended to say, look, this is a better pathway. Include red meat, include whole eggs for these micronutrients. That's your body needs. You'll perform better. You'll stay stronger longer. You'll feel better and not accumulate these chronic conditions, hopefully at all, and not have the rebound from competition. And I prepared Nadia Wyatt for the Miss Olympia 2 years in a row. She took third place. She was completely shredded. She ate steak and fruit and potatoes every single day, sent me a picture of every meal, was still squatting 2 1/4 for reps right up till a week before the show, which she loves to do. She loves to lift heavy weights. Her cardio preparing for that show was 3 10-minute walks a day after meals. That was it. She didn't put 2 hours in on the treadmill, and she was shredded. She was the hardest woman on stage. You acquire that mostly through diet, but you retain your lean body mass through resistance training, as we talked about earlier, not lightening the weights and increasing the reps, but maintaining a really intense, heavy, and that doesn't mean you can't do 10, 12 repetitions, but it's still heavy. As your strength declines in the gym, you have to assume that your muscle mass is also declining. And so that should be one of your primary goals, particularly for that industry. And so she did 2 a day weight training instead of doing all that excessive cardio. I touched on a lot of stuff that's probably the top 5 or 6 things that I recommend in the diet when I get a client.
What I would throw back out there, just out of curiosity's sake, is assuming that they're not supplementing anything, and I'm sure that they are, just regular supplements.
Yeah.
And with that restrictive diet, when you also see a deficiency in electrolytes because they're pulling the salt.
Yeah, that's why I keep the salt and
right?
the potassium in there. Yeah,
as well as A, D, E, and K.
Yeah, 100%.
The fat's being pulled.
Yeah, you shouldn't get your fats. That's why I like a top sirloin steak. It's still got.
No, I'm talking the tilapia, the rice,
right,
the old school
and the egg
stuff.
yolk.
Yes.
Here's what the gurus will tell you is that eat egg whites, but throw a dollop of peanut butter in there for your fat.
Exactly.
That doesn't replace an egg yolk.
Yes.
Not only is it not a good protein source, deficient in leucine, not a complete protein, polyunsaturated fats, but it doesn't have the biotin and the choline and all the other micronutrients that are in the whole egg. But you're right. I do initially. I'll bring fats down, like I might start with a New York steak, and then a month later I might go to a top sirloin, then a month later I might get to a sirloin tip or a top round or a grass-fed steak to bring the fats down. But I don't like to see them below 20% of total calories. It's unnecessary. That's the point at which I might start reducing carbohydrates. I love to keep carbs in for performance. That's to fuel those anaerobic workouts. I prefer to keep 50% carbs in, and I'll only start to bring them down that last month or so as necessary, just to get that last few pounds of body fat off.
Yeah. I'm thinking more of D has become more and more prevalent, especially since this thing that we've been living through the last 100%. Couple of years. It's coming through the roof, where in my mind process, and I'm no expert in this, if you're supplementing D, but you have no fat in your diet, it's not going to do a whole hell of a lot.
That's true of A, D, E, and K all together.
Yeah, exactly. You're just throwing it away to where the reason I bring this up is I had a friend of mine that was was on a super low fat diet, and it wouldn't go up. And I'm like, if you keep doing it, take a tablespoon of peanut butter when you take the D.
Right.
You need some fats to be able to get there.
100%.
And it went straight up. And he's like, holy shit. I'm like, we're not talking about, you see what I'm saying? You can't just pull a macronutrient completely out of your diet and assume that there's not going to be any ramifications.
Yeah. Same is true of omega-3s. I do salmon twice a week, about 5-ounce serving. That's sufficient to get the amount of omega-3 that I think most research has suggested is healthy. And some people will talk about eating, say, a grass-finished steak instead of a grain-finished steak to get more omega-3s. It's not a meaningful dose. Salmon has 200 times the omega-3s as steak, whether it's grass or grain-fed. It's just pixie dusting at that point. It's not meaningful. It doesn't provide you any benefit. Same thing would be true of, say, a pink salt. People talk about all the minerals in there. They're not of significant enough quantity to give you any meaningful benefit, and it's absent iodine. So if it tastes great for you, eat it, but you're going to need an iodine source, and don't count on that for things like magnesium and your other micronutrients that you're going to want to get. Magnesium's another one hard to get from food. I usually supplement that one as well.